He is the most sampled artist in history, a rhythmic architect who built the foundation of hip-hop, funk, and soul. But the Godfather reigned with a velvet glove and a literal iron fist. From a childhood spent in a South Carolina brothel to a high-speed chase involving shotguns and state lines, James Brown's life was a frantic, beautiful, and often violent masterpiece. He couldn't read music, yet he commanded the world to dance to his heartbeat. To understand the sonic earthquake that was James Brown, you must first understand the absolute silence that preceded it. Here was a man who stood atop the musical world for decades, dictating the evolution of American sound, yet he never learned to read a single note of sheet music. He operated on pure, raw instinct, possessing an ear so terrifyingly sharp it could pinpoint a single flat note in a 30-piece orchestra amidst a wall of blaring brass. He wasn't just a singer. He was a conductor of human energy, a man who believed that perfection was the only acceptable baseline for existence. But that legendary obsession with control didn't come from a place of vanity. It was born from a childhood where he had absolutely none. Let's pull back the curtain to May 3, 1933, in a tiny, weathered shack in rural South Carolina. James Joseph Brown entered a world that didn't seem to want him. Born to a 16-year-old mother and an abusive father, his first breath was taken in the suffocating grip of the Great Depression. By the age of 6, the people who were supposed to protect him simply walked away, leaving a young boy to navigate the treacherous, segregated waters of the Deep South entirely alone. He eventually found a roof over his head with his Aunt Honey, but it wasn't a traditional home. She ran a brothel and sold moonshine to survive. This was James's playground, a world of illicit thrills, desperate men, and the constant hum of the hustle. It was here that the future godfather of soul learned his first real lesson. If you want to eat, you have to perform. He would dance and sing for his aunt's customers, catching pennies and nickels thrown by men looking for a momentary distraction from their own bleak lives. Every shimmy and every high note was a cold transaction for survival. The desperation of the streets eventually led him to the wrong side of the law. By the age of 16, the rhythm of the hustle landed him in a juvenile detention center in Georgia, convicted of robbery. Many would see a prison cell as the end of the road, but for James, it was a high-stakes rehearsal hall. Behind those bars, he formed a gospel quartet with his cellmates, earning the nickname Music Box because he simply wouldn't stop singing. It was a profound irony. The man who would eventually define the secular, rebellious sound of a generation found his divine spark in the middle of a cage. In that sweltering Georgia facility, James wasn't just serving time. He was building an empire from nothing. He realized that his voice was a key that could open doors no locksmith could touch. He was beginning to understand the power of the one, the downbeat that could stir people up and command their absolute attention. He was a convict with a dream, and he was about to meet the man who would help him set the entire world on fire, starting with a song that almost never made it to the airwaves. But before he could conquer the charts, James had to navigate a world that still saw him as just another number in a cell, and his first taste of freedom would come with a price he hadn't yet learned how to pay. Freedom for James Brown wasn't just about stepping outside the prison gates. It was about finding a vehicle for the fire burning in his chest. That vehicle arrived in the form of Bobby Byrd. Byrd wasn't just a fellow musician. He was the man who saw the raw, unrefined diamond inside the convict. Byrd's family took James in, providing the stability he had lacked since infancy, and together they transformed a gospel group into a secular powerhouse, the famous Flames. They began tearing through college campuses and smoke-filled nightclubs, honing a sound that was grittier and more urgent than anything on the radio. James wasn't just singing the blues, he was exorcising his demons in front of a live audience. The turning point came with a song that almost didn't happen. Please, Please, Please was a raw, repetitive plea that defied the polished standards of the mid-1950s. When they brought the demo to King Records, the executives were skeptical. It didn't sound like a hit. It sounded like a man begging for his life. But James knew something they didn't. He knew that emotion, when delivered with enough frequency and power, was undeniable. The single exploded, peaking at number 5 on the Billboard charts and signaling the arrival of a new kind of star. This wasn't just rhythm and blues, it was the birth of soul. By 1959, the momentum was unstoppable. The group hit number 1 on the R&B charts with Try Me, a smoother, more melodic track that proved James could handle ballads just as easily as he could handle the high-octane grit of the streets. He was no longer just a local curiosity. He was a national phenomenon. He was collaborating with Bobby Byrd, building a partnership that would define the next decade of music. But as the fame grew, so did the weight of the crown. James was beginning to realize that to stay at the top, he couldn't just be a singer. He had to be a general. The transition from a member of a group to the undisputed soul brother number 1 was swift and calculated. James began to distance himself, eventually billing the act as James Brown and the Famous Flames. He was learning the business of music, realizing that his name was the brand, and his vision was the law. He was willing to outwork, outdance, and outhustle anyone in the industry, earning him the title of the hardest working man in show business. But as the spotlight grew brighter, the shadows within his own organization began to deepen. He was building a legendary reputation for brilliance, but behind the curtain, his band was starting to realize that working for the Godfather came with a price that went far beyond long hours on the road. To play in James Brown's band was to live in a state of constant, vibrating anxiety. He demanded nothing short of absolute perfection, a standard he modeled through his own tireless attention to detail. This wasn't a jam session, it was a military operation. James dubbed himself the hardest working man in show business, and he expected every musician, backup singer, and dancer to mirror his fanaticism. If you were in his circle, you were expected to show up on time, perfectly dressed, and completely sober. There were no second chances in the Godfather's empire. The discipline was enforced through a legendary system of fines that kept the band in a state of perpetual fear. James had a music box ear, a supernatural gift that allowed him to detect a single wrong note from a trumpet in the middle of a thunderous, high-speed funk groove. Even though he couldn't read a single line of sheet music, he knew the language of sound better than the classically trained professionals he hired. He would be in the middle of a frantic dance move, spinning and dropping to his knees, and yet his ears were scanning the stage like radar. If you missed a beat, you felt his gaze before you heard his voice. During a live performance, James would signal his displeasure with a subtle flick of his fingers. He would wave his hand in the direction of the offending musician mid-dance, and the number of fingers he flashed corresponded to the dollar amount of the fine they would face after the show. 5 fingers meant $50. A point meant 100. It was a high-stakes game of musical chess played in front of thousands of screaming fans. He was a perfectionist who understood that the difference between a good show and a legendary one lived in the smallest of margins. This obsession with control extended to the physical appearance of his crew. Uniforms had to be pressed, shoes had to be shined to a mirror finish, and hair had to be impeccable. To James, the visual presentation was just as important as the sonic one. It was a sign of respect for the audience and a declaration of power. He was a man who had grown up with nothing, and now that he had the world's attention, he refused to let a single loose thread or a missed cue diminish his stature. He was the architect of a new sound, and he would let no one, not even his closest collaborators, get in the way of his vision. Yet, even as he controlled every note and every movement on stage, there were parts of his own life that were beginning to spiral out of his command. The man who demanded total sobriety from his band was about to enter a period of his life where his own temper and eccentricities would lead to some of the most bizarre and dangerous confrontations in music history. Music may have been the vessel that carried James Brown to immortality, but it wasn't his only obsession. Long before he was sliding across stages in sequined capes, James was a young man who saw his future in the dirt of a baseball diamond and the sweat of a boxing ring. He was a natural athlete, possessing a raw, explosive physicality that he took very seriously. As a teenager, he trained with the same ferocity he would later apply to his band, dreaming of breaking out of the South through professional sports. He wanted to be a hero in a stadium, not just a singer in a club. But fate had a different rhythm in mind. A severe leg injury brought those aspirations to a premature, agonizing halt, forcing him to redirect all that bottled-up kinetic energy into something else. Even though his professional sports career ended before it began, the athlete never truly left the man. James began to model his stage persona after his sporting idols, most notably the legendary Jackie Robinson. In 1947, Robinson had broken the color barrier in Major League Baseball, but James wasn't just watching Robinson's batting average, he was watching his movements. He was captivated by the way Robinson would do the splits while playing first base in the Negro Leagues and the majors, a display of supreme athletic flexibility and flair. James took that specific high-intensity move and transplanted it directly onto the stage, turning a defensive baseball maneuver into the most iconic dance move in the history of soul. Every time you saw James Brown drop into a perfect split and pop back up without missing a beat, you weren't just watching a singer. You were watching a frustrated first baseman reclaiming his glory. This desperation to be seen and to succeed led him to some of the strangest chapters of his early career, including a stint where he wasn't even James Brown. Early on, he shared a manager with the flamboyant rock and roll pioneer Little Richard. When Richard became a massive star, he often found himself overbooked or unable to make certain dates. In those moments, the future godfather of soul would step into the breach, literally putting on the clothes and the persona of his friend. James would take the stage and perform a near-flawless Little Richard impersonation, channeling the wop babaloo bop energy with terrifying accuracy. He was so good at the hustle that he could almost carry the illusion, though he later admitted he could never truly fool an audience that had come to see the real Richard. These years of impersonation and athletic discipline were the forge in which his identity was tempered. He was learning how to command a crowd by any means necessary, whether by stealing a split from a baseball legend or a falsetto from a rock star. He was a man hungry for a legacy, willing to be anyone or do anything to ensure he would never have to return to the silence of that South Carolina shack. He was building a toolkit of performance tricks that would eventually make him the most dangerous man in show business, a title he would defend with more than just his voice. Because as much as James loved the applause, he loathed the competition, and when another artist dared to mock the very moves he had bled to perfect, the hardest working man proved that he was also one of the most volatile. The world of 1960s R&B was a battlefield, and James Brown was its most territorial general. His rise to the top was fueled by a competitive streak that bordered on the pathological. He didn't just want to be the best, he wanted to ensure that no one else could even stand in his shadow. This intense pride eventually led to one of the most infamous and dangerous feuds in music history: the war with Joe Tex. Tex was a brilliant artist in his own right, but he and Brown had a long-running, bitter dispute, with both men accusing the other of stealing stage moves, performance styles, and even fashion choices. In James's mind, there was only room for one king, and anyone else was a pretender to the throne. The tension reached a boiling point one night in 1963 during a shared bill. Joe Tex, known for his wit and stage presence, decided to take a direct shot at the centerpiece of James Brown's act, the cape routine. During James's shows, he would collapse in simulated exhaustion, only to be draped in a regal cape by a handler before miraculously recovering to finish the song. It was high drama, a liturgical display of endurance and rebirth. That night, Tex took the stage first, draped in a tattered, hole-filled blanket, mocking James's sacred ritual with a comedic, bumbling version of the cape act. The audience roared with laughter, but backstage, James Brown was vibrating with a cold, murderous fury. To James, this wasn't just a joke. It was a desecration of his craft. Later that evening, the Godfather decided that words and songs were no longer enough to settle the score. Reports from the night suggest that James sought out Tex with a shotgun in hand. The details of the ensuing chaos are the stuff of dark rock and roll legend. Tex managed to escape the immediate confrontation, but Brown allegedly began firing, and in the frantic scramble that followed, several people were caught in the crossfire and injured. It was a terrifying glimpse into the man behind the music, a man who lived on such a razor's edge of pride and trauma that he was willing to risk everything to defend his reputation. The law eventually stepped in, but the message was sent. You did not mock James Brown and expect to walk away clean. This volatility was the shadow side of the perfectionism he demanded from his band. The same fire that allowed him to revolutionize the American sound was the fire that threatened to consume everyone around him. He was a man of extremes, capable of the most disciplined musical innovation one moment and the most reckless violence the next. He viewed his career as a war for respect, a war he had been fighting since he was 6 years old and abandoned. Every chart-topping hit and every sold-out show was a fortification in his empire, and he guarded those walls with a ferocity that few dared to test twice. Yet, despite the internal and external chaos, James was about to make a move that would change the music industry forever. He was tired of the labels telling him what the public wanted, and he was about to bet his entire fortune on a live recording that everyone told him would be a disaster. A move that would either cement his legend or leave him bankrupt. By 1962, James Brown was a star, but he was a star within a system he didn't trust. He was tired of the traditional industry logic that prioritized studio-polished singles over the raw, sweat-soaked energy of his live performances. He knew that his true power wasn't captured in a sterile recording booth. It was found in the electric connection between him and a screaming audience. He approached his label, King Records, with a revolutionary idea. He wanted to record a live album at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. The executives laughed him out of the room. They argued that live albums didn't sell and that it was a waste of money to record songs people had already bought as singles. They saw a risk. James saw his destiny. When the label refused to fund the project, James didn't back down. He doubled down. In a move that was unheard of at the time, he reached into his own pockets and put up the money to record the show himself. This was more than just a musical choice. It was a high-stakes business gamble that could have bankrupted him. On October 24, 1962, the tapes rolled as James pushed himself to the absolute limit, delivering a performance so intense it felt like the building might collapse. The resulting album, Live at the Apollo, didn't just sell, it exploded. It reached number 2 on the Billboard charts and stayed on the charts for 66 weeks. James had proven that he understood his audience better than any executive ever could. This victory gave James the leverage to begin his most profound musical transformation. He started to strip away the traditional melodic structures of R&B, focusing instead on the rhythm. He began to treat every instrument, the horns, the guitars, and even his own voice, as a percussion instrument. With the release of Cold Sweat in 1967, the world heard something entirely new. The press struggled to describe it, eventually settling on a word that would define an era: funk. This was a music of the one, a heavy emphasis on the first beat of every measure that created a hypnotic, irresistible groove. He was no longer just following the beat. He was inventing a new way for the world to move. As he mastered this new sound, his influence began to transcend the dance floor. The late 1960s were a time of massive social upheaval in America, and James Brown found himself at the epicenter of the conversation. He was no longer just an entertainer. He was a cultural force with the power to soothe a nation or ignite a revolution. He realized that his platform was a weapon, and he was finally ready to use it to speak a truth that many in power were afraid to hear. He was about to record an anthem that would change the way Black America saw itself forever. But while he was becoming a hero to millions, James was still fighting personal battles with his own identity. Battles that would lead to some of the most bizarre aesthetic choices of his later years. In 1968, the United States was a tinderbox of racial tension. The civil rights movement was transitioning into the Black Power movement, and the air was thick with a demand for dignity and self-determination. James Brown stepped into this void with a song that would become the definitive soundtrack of the era. Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. This wasn't just a hit, it was a manifesto. By inviting a group of children to shout the chorus back at him, James created a bridge between generations, turning a rhythmic funk track into a tool for social transformation. He became a diplomat of the streets, famously performing in Boston the night after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination to help prevent the city from erupting in violence. However, being the godfather of soul was an exhausting role to play, and as the 1970s progressed, the pressure began to take a toll on his personal life and his physical appearance. James was a man obsessed with being presentable on stage, a holdover from his early days of poverty where looking sharp was a sign of status. As he got older, he began to struggle with the loss of his natural eyebrows, a minor detail that became a major fixation for him. In 1991, in a quintessential James Brown move, he decided he'd had enough of the daily maintenance. He shaved off what remained of his natural hair and had permanent eyebrows tattooed onto his face. It was a permanent solution for a man who refused to let time or nature dictate his image. While his personal life often spiraled into the eccentric or the controversial, his musical impact only grew more dominant. By the 1980s, a new generation of artists was emerging: hip-hop. These young producers didn't just admire James Brown, they built their entire world on top of him. Today, James Brown is officially the most sampled artist in human history. His music has been used by other acts over 3,000 times, a number that is more than double his closest competitor, Public Enemy. Every time you hear a rhythmic breakbeat or a sharp in a modern rap song, you are hearing the echo of the man from South Carolina. He provided the DNA for the most dominant cultural movement of the 21st century. His career had slowed in the late 70s, but the rise of hip-hop brought him back into the spotlight as a venerated elder statesman. He continued to perform with the same terrifying energy well into his 70s, refusing to let the fire go out. He had gone from a prisoner to a pioneer, from a homeless child to the most influential musician in American history. He had survived the brothels, the jails, and the feuds, but the one thing even the Godfather couldn't outrun was the clock. His final years would be a blur of accolades and health struggles, leading to a Christmas Day that the world of music would never forget. A final curtain call for the man who never knew how to stop working. The transition from the 1970s into the 1980s was a period of profound evolution for the music industry, and James Brown, ever the survivor, refused to be left behind. While his chart dominance had slowed significantly by 1976, the sonic revolution he started was just beginning its second act. A new generation of artists in the South Bronx was picking up the discarded elements of his funk, the drum breaks, the grunts, and the rhythmic stabs, and using them to build the foundation of hip-hop. He wasn't just an influence anymore. He was the raw material of a new world. To these young producers, James Brown was the ultimate source, a man whose work was so rhythmically perfect it could be looped for eternity. As the 1980s roared on, James found himself revitalized by this newfound relevance. He was no longer fighting for space on the R&B charts. He was being celebrated as the architect of the entire landscape. Yet, even as his professional life saw a resurgence, the physical toll of being the hardest working man in show business began to manifest. Decades of dropping into the splits, sprinting across stages, and maintaining a military-grade tour schedule had battered his body. He was a man who lived at 100 miles per hour, but even a machine as finely tuned as James Brown had a breaking point. Despite the warning signs, he stayed on the road. The stage was his sanctuary, the only place where the boy from the South Carolina brothel truly felt like a king. He continued to perform with a ferocity that shamed artists a third of his age, even as he battled the creeping shadows of congestive heart failure. He refused to slow down because, in his mind, silence was the equivalent of death. He had to keep moving, keep the band tight, and keep the audience on their feet. He was a prisoner of his own legendary work ethic, a man who believed that if he stopped for even a moment, the world would forget the name James Brown. The end came with a poetic, albeit tragic, timing. On Christmas Eve 2006, the man who had given the world so much joy was admitted to a hospital in Atlanta. On Christmas Day, the heart that had provided the beat for millions finally stopped. The godfather of soul was gone, but the silence he had feared never actually arrived. At his funeral, thousands gathered to say goodbye to the man who had transformed American culture, but the true celebration was happening in speakers and headphones across the globe. He had spent his life chasing perfection and demanding control over every note, yet his greatest achievement was something he couldn't control: the way his spirit would be reborn every time a needle hit a groove. He had left behind a blueprint for survival that transcended music, but the question remained: what happens to the world when the man who provided its heartbeat finally leaves the stage? James Brown's journey began in a wooden shack and ended in the pantheon of the gods. Today, his physical form is gone, but his presence is inescapable. He remains the most sampled artist in human history, a ghost in the machine of every modern pop, rap, and R&B track. He was a man of immense contradictions, a disciplinarian who lived a chaotic life, a pioneer who couldn't read music, and a hero of civil rights who struggled with his own internal demons. His success wasn't just a result of talent, it was a result of a relentless, almost desperate will to be seen and respected. The godfather of soul taught us that the rhythm of life isn't found in the melody, but in the one, that singular driving force that pushes us forward regardless of the obstacles in our path. He proved that even when the world abandons you, you can still create a sound that forces the world to listen. His life was a testament to the power of the hustle and the price of perfection. While many of his contemporaries have faded into nostalgia, James Brown remains contemporary, a permanent fixture in the DNA of global sound. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the legendary life of James Joseph Brown. His story is a reminder that greatness is never given. It is taken, practiced, and defended with everything you have. If you found this journey into the roots of funk as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Age of Vintage channel to join our growing community of music lovers. We'd love to hear from you. Which James Brown track is the one that always gets you moving? Or what part of his incredible life surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep the groove alive, and remember, whatever you do, do it with soul.